Welcome to the Cognitive Crucible, produced by the Information Professionals Association. Our website is information-professionals.org, where you can find links and information about today's conversation and get access to members-only content. Join John Bicknell and explore all aspects of our generational challenge, cognitive security.
Today's guest on the Cognitive Crucible is Mr. Duan Lee, who is the Senior Director of Research and Strategy at Zignal Labs, a leading AI-empowered media intelligence analytics and influence risk solutions company. He leverages emerging AI technologies to support and enable open society and national security. Mr. Lee is a national security expert specializing in disinformation analysis and great power competition in the information environment. Before joining Zignal Labs, Mr. Lee was a faculty member and principal investigator at the Naval Postgraduate School, where his work focused on countering violent extremist networks and authoritarian regimes. Duan Lee, welcome to the Cognitive Crucible.
Thank you so much, John. I'm really excited to join this podcast.
Well, we are excited to have you. And to start things off, I'm hoping that you can give our audience a little bit more background about your career and your national security expertise.
Oh, thank you, John. Yes, I'm delighted to offer a little bit more context. So I was trained as a political scientist and quantitative methodology. I got my first teaching job at the Naval Postgraduate School. And my professional focus has been on understanding the nexus between state actors and non-state actors. In the past 10 years, the nexus was really pronounced in irregular warfare and information warfare. And that kind of defined my professional portfolio. Initially, I started using a lot of social network analysis to understand how violent extremist networks or terrorist organizations come about and expand, leveraging different resources in the general population. Perhaps in the past 5 years, the nexus kind of shifted to the information environment. And I've been working very closely with several federal government R&D agencies to understand how our country can combat disinformation more effectively, both in the information environment as well as in the physical world. Mm-hmm. So I think that defines who I am, what I care about, and I think if you think about how much mis and disinformation is propagating about the coronavirus pandemic, now I think the threat of disinformation goes well beyond just national security. It touches on public health, public safety, as well as electoral integrity.
Right. Well, I think there's a lot to talk about there. I think it might be helpful to linger for just a moment on the notion of disinformation and fake news. I'm sure you have some thoughts or some more, precise definition of, what exactly disinformation and fake news is, how it works, and why it is something that is so top of mind these days.
Yeah, so let me start with why it is becoming so pervasive. I would cite two major factors behind the proliferation of disinformation. One is that when it comes to statecraft, I think our country has been predominant on several domains, right? Think about like the land domain, right? Think about the air domain. Think about even the space domain, right? So a lot of our peer competitors essentially, had to find a domain where they may have some kind of comparative advantage, and also very cost effective, right? We still have the largest economy in the world, and a lot of our peer competitors cannot marshal the kind of resources for traditional national security measures, right? So in that sense, they've been striving to find that gap where they don't have kind of comparative disadvantage, and that is also very cost effective to grow at scale, right? Think about aircraft carriers. It takes years of R&D, tons of money to field an aircraft carrier group and etc., right? But if you think about how to use perhaps social media or other digital media platforms to essentially compete against our national interests overseas, the information environment is a super cost-effective platform for a lot of them. So that is one factor. And related to the first factor is essentially the increasing connectivity of the physical world, right? So back in the day, we used to say 6 degrees of separation, right? And that was like perhaps a generation ago. Right now, an average person has about 161 immediate ties, right? Mostly on the information environment. So think about access and placement. Think about reach, right? And this rapidly increasing connectivity is also what enables a lot of revisionist states to exploit disinformation at scale. Now, let me move on
this is really emerging as a persistent theme. Especially your first point that the technology today is cheap and it's available and it's scalable, and it's something that any nation state can deploy to great effect, asymmetric effect, and compete directly with the United States and the West's technological advantage or our infrastructure advantage. You're talking about aircraft carriers and our robust Department of Defense and kinetic capabilities are being greatly challenged by this very inexpensive, scalable information and weaponized AI technology.
Precisely. And to me, what is really concerning is the emergence of completely different political systems about technology, right? And what really worries me about this rise of disinformation as a strategic, toolkit is that, AI can be only as sophisticated as the kind of training data, right, that you ingest to essentially make AI smarter and more scalable, right? And to me, the rise of revisionism, and especially the rise of authoritarian regimes in the information environment, is particularly troubling. The reason being, they can exploit a large volume of user data to come up with incredibly weaponized AI systems. And we already see this manifestation in a lot of authoritarian regimes using disinformation campaigns against us, against the West, against the liberal political order. So this is something that we should pay a lot of attention to moving forward.
Right. Well, so your expertise includes disinformation in conjunction with crises. We'll come to the current COVID crisis and disinformation. Do you have any other examples of previous crises that have also had a disinformation campaign that's been, part of the effort?
Of course. In fact, disinformation has always been a recurring theme in all major crises or conflict, right? So think about, Patton's, Third Army during the Normandy invasion, right? So, military deception has been an enduring feature of warfare, period. I think is the trend has not changed very much, but it's the pace, it's the scale that has changed dramatically. Let me give you a couple of more examples. during the Crimean, crisis, we saw the same pattern, right?
Yeah.
Because when there is instability, right, people have this desire to seek corroborating information, right? But instability also undermines the viability of existing communication infrastructure, right? Because journalists cannot go to war zones freely, right? Media outlets cannot go to failed states freely, and this is the gap and seam that a lot of revisionist states, namely the Kremlin and the CCP, are exploiting to quite effect. So we saw the same pattern during the Ukraine civil war. In fact, if you look at the the 2019 Ukraine presidential election, there was a massive wave of disinformation coming from the Kremlin. So it used to be an afterthought when it comes to understanding great power competition, right? IO or information warfare was something of a support element. But I feel like that relationship is essentially in reverse order right now because again when it comes to great power competition, there are two domains that our competitors are really trying to take the upper hand on, and that is cyber and information.
Right, and you're touching on something that I think is a critical difference in the way that the United States tends to deploy information operations compared to our great power competitors, and that's namely that we deploy information operations in support of other kinetic operations, whereas China and Russia may be deploying information operations continually as part of a just status quo operations below the level of armed conflict.
Absolutely. And, I think, to me, this is, I don't want to get too philosophical about
No, that's fine. Get philosophical.
Yeah, but to me, this is the main difference between, what I call Westphalian statecraft and revolutionary statecraft. And that is, if you look at the CCP and the Kremlin, they still retain a lot of revolutionary, TTPs, right? And the main difference is that, Westphalian statecraft is based on, what I call explosion or external pressure, right? The revolutionary counterparts focus on what I call implosion, right? And that is when they see vulnerabilities in our society, right? How do you essentially amplify and exploit those vulnerabilities, right? Without having to get into any domain where we reign supreme, right? And the answer is very simple, right? They cannot reach, different dissident groups or political, organizations or protest events in the United States directly. Physically they cannot do it. In terms of the human domain, it's hard to do it, right? But when they use disinformation, right, as a strategic tool, they can easily exploit our internal divisions. To me, that really defines the crux of what I call revolutionary statecraft. Perhaps that is something that we need to revisit because it is in our strategic DNA. Let's remember that this nation has started as the most effective revolution movement against the most powerful empire of the day.
Right. So this starts leading us into the current COVID crisis, and so our adversaries have AI tools to potentially to algorithmically understand where are the fault lines in our public discourse, and then also AI tools to exploit those fault lines. And so what are the types of things that you are observing that are, either most likely or most definitely information attack vectors from, from some of our adversaries that, relevant to the current COVID crisis?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I do see some experimental TTPs coming from the CCP and the Kremlin. And namely, they try really hard to establish plausible deniability. And attribution is a really hard business to get into when it comes to disinformation mitigation. What I mean by that is fairly straightforward, and that is they don't do overt, state-centric information operations. They employ a large army of seemingly legitimate media outlets. And those are the media outlets they target in overseas information environments as well. And this goes back to the crux of my professional life, and that is understanding the nexus between state actors and non-state actors, right?
Yeah.
And what the CCP is doing really well is, I don't want to sound like a paranoid person, but I think we should err on the side of caution. And that is, there are a lot of, diaspora communities in the world, right? And they have their local, media outlets and so on and so forth. And essentially, they maintain these large networks of quote unquote friendly outlets, right? To push their disinformation, targeting perhaps existing, racial divisions or socioeconomic, divisions and so on and so forth. So I'll give you a very concrete example. When we were going through civil unrest or civil rights movements in the past few months, right?
You're talking about it within the United States.
Yes, within the United States, right?
Okay, yeah. So civil unrest that's been sparked by,
the death of George Floyd,
the George Floyd event, and probably exacerbated by just a general feeling of worry and uncertainty with the whole virus and everything.
Yeah, and it goes to both sides of the ideological spectrum, right? Because we've seen also a lot of perhaps anti-mask protests, right? Yep. So I'm not being, political. I'm just trying to make sure that we understand that they do not discriminate any political actions across the ideological spectrum, right? And the idea is that I've seen a lot of, CCP affiliated outlets, perhaps amplifying the most radical elements on the left side of the spectrum, while the Kremlin-affiliated or Kremlin-friendly outlets would be amplifying and exploiting the most fringe elements of the far right of the ideological spectrum, right? And this is really troubling to me because, perhaps between 15 and 16, it was mostly just the Kremlin trying to essentially polarize our organic political discourse. Now, it's not just the Kremlin trying to, exacerbate that polarization. And in terms of who has the most resources to exacerbate this kind of coordinated disinformation, Russia, we think that Russia is 10 feet tall, right? But it's still, the 11th, largest economy in the world, right? They're GDP per capita is laughable, right? China, on the other hand, is a completely different beast. And what worries me is that the CCP is learning from the success of the Kremlin's disinformation campaigns, and they're doing it at scale, not regionally, but globally. And this is perhaps the most menacing threat that I want to share with your audience.
Did I hear you correctly? Don't let me put words in your mouth, but in your professional opinion, do you think that at at some level, there is coordination between China and Russia, and hitting opposite ends of the political spectrum, for example, in customized information campaigns? Or do you think that there's not sufficient evidence to be able to state that kind of thing?
Yeah, I would like, I feel inclined to side with the latter.
Okay.
I see collusion, right?
Okay. Yeah.
But coordination is something that is much harder to
Yeah.
establish, especially just, relying on, open source intelligence, right? But there are certain indications that I find quite troubling. And the idea is that, I see a lot of, Kremlin TTPs being employed by the CCP at scale. So I do think there is a lot of mimicking going on. There is a lot of strategic learning going on the CCP's part, right? And also there is another indication I want to share with your audience, and that is just a couple of weeks ago, the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs and their counterpart in Russia essentially came up with a joint statement stating that they will essentially cooperate to mitigate Western disinformation, right? What I'm reading is the opposite, and that is, hey, we can achieve much greater effects by working together against the United States and against the West. So, you see a lot more bilateral, cooperative initiative taking place between the CCP and the Kremlin, and that should be highly troubling to all national security stakeholders and leaders.
Right. Well, so in the U.S., we tend to be hyper focused on us, right? It's all about me, right? I'm the most important person in the world to me, and I think the U.S. we tend to feel that way about ourselves. But you're alluding to worldwide scalable information operations, which are not just targeted at the U.S., but there's Africa and developing nations throughout the world, which are presumably also being targeted with information campaigns by both Russia and China. Do you have any thoughts about the kinds of information campaigns that are being levied at the third world or the emerging economies?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, John. And to me, I'm always trying to peel as many layers as I can, and trying to understand what's causing this, right? And speaking of CCP propaganda in the rest of the world, right? To me, there is an important background factor to consider, and that is, I'm pretty sure you are familiar with the Road and Belt Initiative. That means the CCP has a lot more assets and projects they need to maintain overseas, right?
It may be helpful for our audience, Duan. Could you give just a 30-second on what the Belt and Road Initiative is?
Unlike our economy, the Chinese economy depends on external trade a lot more, right? And in order to dump some of its overcapacity, production capacity, the CCP has been pushing this overseas infrastructure and logistics, projects quite a bit. Oftentimes, being very aggressive with loan programs to essentially ensnarl developing countries with what we call, debt trap, right? So, maritime logistics or land-based, logistics. So these represent perhaps Xi Jinping's most ambitious strategic endeavor.
Right. It's like a sprawling trade infrastructure with which favors China policies
Correct.
and
Correct.
GDP.
Because they have to sell, right? And to sell effectively, they need essentially effective logistics, right?
Yeah.
And they had to dump a lot of overproduction capacity. Essentially, it's what I call like strategic dumping, right? So it is not to benefit these developing countries very much. So that is one key background we need to take into account, and that is now that you have a lot more Chinese personnel, Chinese projects overseas, right? And you need to essentially ensure that they are well perceived by local populations. So in that sense, there is this palpable increase of strategic propaganda outside China and essentially like outside United States as well. And let me add another sort of observation to that statement. Also, let's look at Russia's economy. Russia's economy depends on two things, right? Energy and weapon sales. Period. Right? I don't think Russia has any more like strategic industries than those two areas, right? Now, energy. To export energy, you need a lot of pipelines, right? And this is where the CCP and the Kremlin are also coordinating quite a bit, but there are also competing interests, especially in Central Asia, right? Weapon sales, where do they go? They follow conflicts, right? So again, Russia has a lot of assets and personnel in highly volatile regions and countries, right? And of course, whenever they interface with local populations, then there is this need for information operations. And I think this kind of economic dynamics really underpin, right, the proliferation of aggressive and strategic information operations taking place in a large number of developing countries.
Well, fascinating stuff, Duan. During every discussion, I like to try to ask our guests to share with the audience a book or two which they may not otherwise be familiar with, which helps illuminate some of this discussion area a little bit more. Do you have a couple of favorites that talk about these kinds of things?
Absolutely, John. Part of my job is, understanding not only the cutting edge, developments, but also understanding the bleeding edge development, right? And my first recommendation would be, and full disclosure, I've known Peter Singer for a while, so I may come across a little bit partial, but I do think that he is the best futurist we've had in our generation. So, Like War by Peter Singer is already about 2 years old, but it is essentially becoming this contemporary manifestation of what we're going through right now, right? Because he's essentially talking about the weaponization of social media and digital media data, right? And even though it's 2 years old, if you read it right now, you'll be shocked how many, analogous, incidents we're experiencing right now. So I think it's a must for all, information warfare, stakeholders, analysts, planners, right? In fact, I think it is a mandatory reading for a lot of military training programs at this point. And he has a new book just came out this year. It's called Burn In. I think it's also a must because Burn In addresses the social and political implications of, AI and automation technology, right? How it's going to redefine politics, how it's going to redefine, public safety, how is it going to redefine law enforcement. So I think those are great books to read, right now. And there's also a more diplomacy related, book on information warfare, and it's called Information Wars by Rick Stengel. He was the longest serving, I think, Deputy Secretary for the State Department. So he understands how perhaps our peer competitors use information operations as a predominantly primary strategic tool, right? And I want to re-emphasize that notion, right? We are coming back to that notion a couple of times, but we really have to understand the reach and the cost effectiveness of information warfare in our DNA, right?
Yep.
And again, increasing connectivity, and the proliferation of digital technology and so on and so forth. A missile is really expensive, but a tweet can reach potentially millions of people, thousands, tens of thousands of miles away, right? To me, that is really the best remote warfare weapon system, period.
Yeah, it is. It is astonishing, and it's astonishing how much this threat has snuck up on us and exploited the weaknesses that are baked into the underside of our magnificent technological infrastructure. It's so much like the in the very first Star Wars movie, right? Finding that exhaust port to drop a bomb in and destroy the Death Star, right? It's kind of like that. The information can seep into our consciousness, into our infrastructure, into our society, and as of today, we are extremely vulnerable to that kind of attack.
Yeah, so I want to offer two concluding remarks, John, if you don't mind. One is that going back to the Star Wars analogy, let's not forget that countless rebel spies had died to get the schematics of the Death Star, right? And there is always that human factor, and that is the power of weaponizing information. Is one thing, right? But to make it as impactful and as resonating as possible, we also have to go back to the logic of narrative, right? How to tell stories that are humanizing, but also represent the best values in us, and essentially using that as an informational firewall against adversarial disinformation, right? So I want to re-emphasize the human factor in all forms of warfare, not just information warfare, but in all forms of warfare, right? And number two, we've been describing this problem set quite a bit. I do also want to offer some perhaps corrective measures, right? And that is, again, I'm sounding like a broken record, but let me go back to the nexus between state actors and non-state actors, and that is, we really need to find the right matching parity, right? The reason that cyber warfare and information warfare are proving so difficult to us is that it's just the volume, right? And we have only so many analysts, we have only so many cyber warriors, we have only so many OSINT analysts, right? The difficulty a lot of times stems from this organizational parity issue, and that is we're not tapping into the largest force we have at our disposal, and that is essentially our own civil society. So it cannot be state-centric alone, right? And this is why in the past 3 years, I've been really advocating for, right, the triple Ps, right? Public-private partnership, so that we can, compete effectively in the information environment.
Wow, some very, very, very hopeful words and constructive solution possibilities. very much appreciated. And of course, that's a big part of this project with the Cognitive Crucible and for the Information Professionals Association in general is to try to create that whole of society or whole of government effort to combat this information problem. And with that, Duan Lee, I would like to thank you so much for being on the Cognitive Crucible.
John, thank you so much for having me. I am truly honored to make this little contribution to your endeavors, right? And again, let's do it again. The reason being, I don't think we talk a lot about possible sort of solutions, technology, organization, and perhaps certain partnership opportunities. So, I'd like to come back at some point to talk more about the solution space.
Wow, I hardly agree. Let's definitely put something out there to get you back on here at a future date. Thank you so much, Duan.
Thank you so much, John.
The Cognitive Crucible is the only podcast dedicated to increasing interdisciplinary collaboration between information operations practitioners, scholars, and policymakers. To find out more about the Information Professionals Association, visit us at information-professionals.org. Please support our podcast by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review.